Alright guys, building selection part 2. In part 1 we looked at great buildings, which is pretty straightforward. Should you plan an arc? Yes, obviously. Should you plan an AI core? Depends on your era. If you're in Bronze Age, probably not a huge priority. Should you plant Chateau? I think most people would say yes. Depends on how much you do recurring quests, but most people would say Chateau is worth having. Not just for goods, but for diamonds and other resources as well. So for the most part, great buildings are pretty straightforward. Event buildings, though, is today's topic, and that's where it gets a little more complicated. This would be an oracle, and we're not going to plant that. We don't even need to talk about that. So let's get into event buildings today. Looking at these two buildings right here, which is better? Well, that really depends on first of all, your city needs, but also your playstyle. This is giving me QI benefits as well as fragments for main city for boost kits. This is giving me goods and forge points. No goods, no forge points. Forge points, goods, no fragments. Population positive, population negative. So there's a handful of different variables in there. And you really got to think about what your city needs in order to say which one is better. There are a few exceptions to this, like some of the Neo buildings, some of the event buildings that are just overpowered on every single metric. Like population neutral gives all 4 attack stats, so red defense, red attack, blue defense, blue attack, tons of goods, plus guild goods and forge points. Same thing with the plazas. Orchard of Orange Streams is insanely productive on population. Ton of goods, ton of forge points. So these are pretty much automatically, yeah, if you got them, plant them. These are also a lot harder to get, especially if you don't spend money on the game, and it's hard to get multiples of. So I have 1 plaza. I have 2 orchards. It's hard to get multiple of these buildings just in normal play. So that's kind of the restriction there. Let's look at some of the more accessible buildings and probably what most of our cities are going to be made of. Okay, and that's going to be this. We've got 4 categories over here, so we'll go over that. This top category here is attack focused. Third category is collection focused. And middle category is balance. So in this top category, attack focused means that we're getting most of our resources like forge points and goods from GVG, Guild Expedition, QI, things like that. The collection focus has lower attack stats, but is getting most of those resources from the collection itself. And then balance is obviously just kind of a happy medium between the two. All 3 of these top groups here are based off of 24 squares of population, which would be a metro and a half in this middle group. 24 squares of population, and then 24 squares of minor buildings. And in pretty much all of these cases, and just in general, the smaller buildings are actually where you're getting most of your output from. But all of these small buildings are also population negative, so we need the population to sustain it from another building, right? And as a general rule, the minor buildings are going to be your best producers, but in order to plant as many of them as you want, you need to balance that with the population consumption. So all 3 of these groups are population neutral. So 24 squares of population, 24 squares of minor buildings, and exact 0 population. So the population cancels out completely, which I think is a fair metric, because if we're saying, oh, which is better, gator or airship, well, what's your population drain? Because the more gators you plant, the less space you're going to have for gators, because it requires more population, if that makes sense. So I'm going to run through these top 3 categories and give you the stats on each group. I don't want to get hyper-focused on specific buildings, because buildings will continue to evolve, and airship is great, right? But a couple years ago, everyone was getting shrines of knowledge, right? So buildings are going to continue to evolve. I don't want to get hyper fixated on, oh, Metro is the greatest building in the game, because it's going to get replaced in Christmas with some other 4x4, that's better or different or whatever. So let's not focus too much on these specific buildings. I want to focus on the idea of these different categories. So are you attack? Are you balanced? Or are you collection? Yeah, pretty simple. I didn't even do that intentionally. ABC, that kind of works out though. All right, so let's go over the stats real quick. On this top group, the Crimson Dragon paired with, it'd be 2.8 of these Green Guardians would be the 48 squares that we're after. We're getting 35 forge points, 250 goods, and then 213 over 240 attack. And that's red GBG. That's the only, I'm not going to look at blue or the base red. We're just looking at red GBG. So very much attack oriented. The balance group over here is going to be 84 forge points, 204 goods, 98 to the guild. Oops, let's, here. 204 goods, 98 to the guild. And then 124 over 108 attack. And then the bottom group, the Serene Animal paired with Alligators, is going to be 72 forge points, 283 goods, 120 to the guild, and 58 over 140 attack. So you can see that this top category definitely favors attack, right? This bottom category is definitely favoring goods and forge points from the city itself. So this is an extra 30 goods on the Serene, plus 120 for the guild. Almost double the forge points at the expense of about half of the attack, though. The middle group is a balance. Less goods, more forge points, happy medium on the guild goods, and a balance of the attack. They're all population neutral, each group, right? So let's look at a couple ingredients here. Gator is extremely efficient on goods and forge points. It's also a huge population drain. Per tile, it's one of the worst in the game. So in order to balance that, you'll end up with extremely efficient population producers, like Serene Animal and Raccoon, that are kind of mediocre on the attack side of things. So you're giving up the attack that you would get from that building in order to sustain the population of an extremely efficient goods producer, right? Versus the top half, where Crimson Dragon is less efficient than Serene Animal on population, but the minor buildings that we're pairing it with also demand less population, and both of them are focused on attack. Does that make sense? And even at the expense of forge points, which is a valid strategy, because if you play GBG enough, it's pretty easy to make up 35 forge points from hitting a couple fights. I kind of tend towards this balance category a little bit more, if not the bottom category, just because I don't always have time to play GBG. I collect pretty much every day, so I would at least like to get those resources from collection, even if I don't have time to do GBG, okay? So that pretty much summarizes those top 3 categories, and like I said, these buildings are going to change, but the concept is true pretty much since I've been playing Forge of Empires, which is many years now. The concept is usually true. There's very few buildings where you can have your cake and eat it too. For the most part, you're going to be picking between, do I want attack or do I want resources from my city itself, okay? This fourth category is my playstyle. This is fragment focused. Of the top three groups, I end up somewhere in here. I still want to be able to attack when I do play, but I can hit around 170, 180 attrition without using boost items or turning grounds or anything like that. So I don't really need to push any higher than that. I want to be able to still get resources from my city though, so I end up somewhere in here out of the top three. But there's a fourth category which is me to a T, and that's fragments. Okay, and the bottom group, let's focus on that group first. These buildings are limited for one reason or another. They're great to have, but they're all limited in some way. Celtic Glassworks, for example, gives goods, forge points, and finished special kits. So awesome building to have. Really hard to get though. I was only able to get 4 in the event, and I don't know a whole lot of people that got more than that without spending a bunch of money. So that's limited in a sense. These new fall event buildings are awesome for quantum incursion boosts, but they're extremely population negative, like brutally population drain. So you're probably limited in the amount of those that you can plant as well. Nutcracker and Ectoplasmic, that's your mass aids and your store items. Neither building is really great on collection. Their only purpose is just to provide those consumable kits. So you only need so many to sustain your daily rate of consumption on those. Same thing with the trees of patience, silence, and vitality. They're reno kits, self-aid kits, one-up kits. Decent production overall, but you don't need 50 million of them. Just plant enough to sustain your the rate of consumption on your consumables. Ori is pretty mediocre on population as well as output in terms of forge points and goods. But it gives 30-minute supply rushes, which come in handy for the rival quests and stuff. So overall, pretty mediocre building, but you probably want those 30-minute supply rushes. So you're limited in the sense that you really only need 2 or 3 of them to meet that daily quota of consumption. Make sense? So let's focus on this middle group next. This is more what I want to focus on. This bottom group is limited, right? Totally misspelled that. This middle group, though, is unlimited. And out of all 5 groups that we're looking at right now, this is the only one that truly is unlimited. These top 3 groups are limited in the sense that your minor buildings, which is what we really want, are population drained, so you need the population parity in order to plant those. So if you could have an entire city of airships, that might be great. But in reality, you can't. You can only have half a city of airships because the other half is the population to sustain it. This middle group, though, is truly unlimited. These are all population neutral. And in this case, the fragments for the smaller buildings are actually produced by the also population neutral main building, right? So the main difference between that and the top 3 groups is I'm not limited to a pair of 24 squares worth of Aegean and 24 squares worth of feta. I can plant 1 Aegean and then 500 squares of feta if I want, and print those feta from the Aegean itself. Same thing with Sunhaven and Jesters. Okay, Jesters, definitely one of my favorites in the game. I actually just stored a couple quote-unquote better buildings in order to replant some of my Sunhavens. I have 63 Jesters now, which I thought was enough, but I kind of want maybe 20 more. I don't know. I love them. It's blue stats only, so there's no red benefit to it. It's got goods, no forge points, but check this out. 10 jesters gives me one FSP kit, finished special, right? And I can apply that finished special kit to eco for 145 forge points, meaning that each jester is giving me 14.5 forge points. On paper, jester does not give forge points, but FSP is the ability to print forge points whenever you want them, which is the reason why I like them. Feta, not quite as efficient on goods or forge points as the alligator, but it's also population neutral. So remember that from the first part. Yes, awesome on goods, awesome on forge points, but you're handcuffed to a mediocre building for population. That is not the case with feta. So even though feta is less efficient than gator pound for pound, the advantage with feta is that you're not handcuffed to the same amount of real estate on the population side. So in other words, if I had 100 squares to work with, I could fill up all 100 squares with feta, whereas I could only fill up 50 squares with gators because I would need 50 squares of population as well. Does that make sense? All of these buildings can be printed or duplicated with only a couple exceptions. That would be Serene Animal, Raccoons, the Fall Event mini buildings, Celtic Glasswork, and Ori. Everything else that we're looking at right now can be printed from another building. So Crimson Dragon Ship can be printed from the Gold League prizes, that event. The Green Guardians can be printed from Eco. This is printed by Zephyr. This is printed by Metro. Gators from Flamingo. Feta from Aegean, and Aegean from that little pink Bougainville tree. Jesters from Sunhaven, and Sunhaven from Trailside Smithy. Nutcracker from Ketabo. Ecto from Labs. Trees from Druid Huts. So when we're talking about building selection, it's not like, well, I have this hodgepodge of buildings in my city, what should I plant? That's usually not a huge limitation anymore. The way that Inno is emphasizing fragments with buildings, that's usually not the case. Usually you actually do have the ability to terraform your city to some extent. So which building should I plant? I don't know. What's your priority? And if you say your priority is attack, okay, focus on buildings that you can print and duplicate that give you that attack, right? Does that make sense? So like I said, most of these buildings, with a few exceptions, Serene Animal was just a event prize, but it doesn't have a parent building that produces it. But there are other equally efficient population producers that can be printed. So more of a theory than specific building focused. When you're thinking about which building do I want, okay, I have the ability to print Aegeans, right? And once I print those, I have the ability to print more feta from them. And I can take my city in that direction intentionally. And it's going to take time, but you can terraform your city to whatever your playstyle actually is. That pretty much covers it on the conceptual side of things. These buildings are going to continue changing, like I said before, but just recognize the pattern in it. You've got attack focused, balanced, collection focused, population neutral with kind of less impressive minor buildings, but population neutral, so that pattern is infinitely repeatable. That's kind of the fourth category in the oddball. And the other half of the fragment side is just the few limited buildings that you need to sustain consumable kits, if that makes sense. I'm going to back out. Let's check my main city just so you can see what I'm working on right now. I actually have an uncomfortable amount of Aegeans planted currently. I stored a bunch of other buildings in order to plant as many Aegeans as I could. And just crank out feta fragments. I actually stored both of my eco labs in order to plant a couple more sun havens and generate more jesters. And my goal is to actually collapse this entire row of gators and replace with primarily feta, but the population that I am saving by eliminating these jesters are going to go to some of the QI buildings, as well as these population consuming attack oriented buildings, but they're also roadless, which is kind of the appeal there to me. So that's the direction that I'm going. And then after I'm done printing feta, I will store all of my Aegeans and print more airships. So that's kind of the direction that I'm going. I'm trying to get rid of these extremely population negative road buildings and get rid of the extreme population positive road buildings that they're paired with in order to favor more population neutral roadless buildings. That's kind of the direction that I'm going. Every city is different, like I said. It really does depend on your priorities. I don't want to give up all of my attack, right, by getting rid of gators, but I can afford to lose a little bit in favor of not only the roadless stuff, but compressing my roads just in general. So getting rid of the gators allows me to compress some of these road groups that I have in the middle. It's kind of a hidden benefit there where, like I mentioned, pound for pound, feta is not as productive as a gator. But once you eliminate the gator and the need for the population to sustain it, you're actually looking at about double the number of feta. And then in that case, it does become more productive. So, hope it helped. I might make a video, a part number 3, that looks at a couple specific buildings more in depth. We'll see. But curious to hear you guys' feedback. Alright, take it easy.